All right, guys, we're going to get started here. All right, everybody. Good to see you guys. All right, so just a couple things. I want to make sure we're on the same page with what's coming up in the schedule. And so, yeah, so we're finishing up where we're at here today, right? So GBL activity 2. Next week we come back. The week before spring break, we'll do all the stuff on cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And on Monday, your concept map is due. So that's the one over the Fick equation. Okay. So how all of those variables change, like we've been talking about. And then, yeah, and then you also have a quiz over that. Yeah, it's actually over an article that is attached to that quiz. And then, yeah, and then Wednesday lab 2 is due. Okay, so did anybody not get the printed out worksheet for that? Yeah. Why, were you busy or something? Yeah. Anybody else? Everybody else good? All right. Yeah, so we got that, and then the way it worked out this time, we won't have the gallery walk review until after spring break, so we're gonna have a lot of time, you know, before we actually have the tests on all of this stuff that we're going over right now. But right when you come back from spring break will be the gallery walk, okay? And those are already assigned to you. Basically, if you just click on gallery walk 2, you'll in the Google Doc there that's linked in the assignment on Canvas, you'll see the team assignments just like you had before. Okay, so just want to communicate about that with your team, and then that exam will be the Wednesday after spring break. Okay, so just kind of keeping that that whole schedule in mind then. All right, questions on any of that? All right. Okay, so I believe we left off here last time, right? Or we kind of skipped this. Yeah, and this was you guys, right? Alex and yeah. Yeah, so one thing, guys, when you're presenting, this is the microphone. We are recorded on Zoom for the remote students. So maybe just like either put this next to you, as long as someone close it, or you can put it back over here when you're talking. Okay. All right, come on up. You guys gonna airplay? Yeah. Yep.
Alright, so we did contractibility, the inherent capacity of the ventral force wave. It represents the performance of the heart at a given preload and afterload at a constant heart rate. Contractibility may determine experimental as long as the change is intermediate isometric force at given initial fiber length. And then these are names, in case you guys are curious. So what controls contractibility? Contract is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. It also increases preload and afterload influence. Increase in preload mechanism fills the ventral with greater volume of blood, causing it to stretch and contract more forcefully. It increases in afterload means that the heart must contract more forcefully to overcome the aortic valve.
Cool. Contractility will increase with the onset of exercise due to the release of catecholamine, either by stimulation of the vagus nerve to increase the heart rate, or epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the inhibition of the parasympathetic nervous system, which drives the heart rate down. So, next slide. Stuff there. Okay, that's fine. Commonly measured by the ejection fraction. It's the most simple. So stroke volume over end-diastolic volume times 100. That's just your percentage of the blood that's making it out of the ventricle. Can also be measured by ESPBR, the in-systolic pressure volume relationship. That's more used in like clinical settings where access to like medical equipment, including I think Doppler, is used to measure that as well. So the relationship between the pressure and the volume of the left or right ventricle when the myocardium reaches its maximum state of activation, airplane system. And so that not only measures like the contractility, but a lot of other factors that are attributed to heart function. So it does help during exercise to increase your stroke volume because improved contractility is especially important during higher intensity exercises. So on the lower end of the intensity spectrum, the French Starling mechanism is helping to increase the stroke volume, whereas higher intensity, you're relying more on the contractile force of the heart itself, of the ventricle. But the more forceful your contractions are, the more efficient you are expelling blood, which means it can fill with more blood.
And some cardiac variables to look to see if it changed is stroke volume and heart rate. For stroke volume, it increases with contractility and it results in increased venous return, also known as preload. And for heart rate, it's because of the sympathetic nervous system, the stimulation to the heart rate and contractility. Then I added calcium concentration just because it is a little bit as well. But the main two are stroke volume and heart rate.
And for the calcium concentration, I've got some notes on it. It increases the intracellular calcium concentration by CMP mediated mechanisms and it acts on the slow voltage gated calcium channel. Essentially what happens with higher heart rates, the myocardium does not have time to expel the intracellular calcium. So it accumulates and increases the force of contraction because intracellular calcium is more available.
Connect those dots one more time. How's the calcium making the contraction stronger?
The concentration intracellularly is increased. It accumulates so that there's more than is needed and it is using all that calcium at an increased rate. Yes.
Using it to do what?
That's how I understood it.
Yeah, that's okay. How would it increase intracellular calcium result in greater force of contraction? You might have on the slide. Yeah. Yeah. So it binds to troponin, right? Or change shape, that's yeah. Yeah, because that's how we get force with our heart, with our muscle contraction, right? Is when that myosin head binds to act. Right? So each new calcium is bound to troponin, we get another myosin head contributing to the force production. Yeah. Cool. All right. Any questions for these guys? All right. Good job. Yeah, just so you my shorthand notes here of what I took while they were talking. Definition right there, as they said, this is all stuff they said, this is the way I wrote it down. Measured by ejection fraction, that's the equation for ejection fraction. Right? Control that sympathetic nervous system, increased catecholamine release, leads to calcium influx, like we were just talking about. That calcium binds to troponin is increased active myosin binding, so we get more force. What other cardiac variable besides ejection fraction would we see a change in when our contractility is increasing? Okay, then what would it do? What would we expect to see in end-systolic volume? Decrease, yeah, right, because if we start out with the same amount of blood in the heart, because at some point, remember, when we looked at that graph of how diastolic volume goes up as we start actually going from like resting to maximal exercise. It goes up a lot more exercise early on, but then in diastolic volume kind of plateaus, like we can't feel the heart anymore, mainly because heart rate's going so fast, right? So then we're totally relying on not putting more blood in the heart, but how much we get out, right? So we'll see in diastolic volume stay about the same from about 70% of max up to 100% of max. But the thing that changes our stroke volume at that point is by decreasing in systolic volume because of this, right? Because of contractility, because we're contracting that heart harder each step along the way. So we empty the heart to a greater extent, right? So that's what we would expect to see seen by a decrease in systolic volume and an increase in ejection fraction. Both of those are kind of evidence of that increase in contractility. Questions on that? Okay, so yeah, so then I think we're on to the AVO2 difference one, right? We dealt with this one and this one last class. So now we're here to the factors that change AVO2. That's you guys. Okay. All right. What's that? Yeah, you can also email it to me, whatever you want to do. Yeah. Try to talk somewhat around the mic here. So. Sound quality. Yeah.
You're good.
All right, guys, it's got your attention here.
So we're talking about AVO2 difference, specifically how it changes with exercise and the factors that deal with it. So there are 4 different factors: blood in capillaries, mitochondrial activation, chemical concentration, and the amount of O2 extracted. So on the slide, we're going to talk about the blood in capillaries, specifically during exercise with vasodilation. And the normal sympathetic response that occurs with exercise is to vasoconstrict, but through sympatholysis, it causes vasodilation just in the muscles to allow for more blood to get into the muscles. And another factor causing vasodilation is waste product buildup, such as H+, lactate, and CO2. And vasodilation is also caused by low pressure of oxygen in the tissues. So overall, it's increasing blood flow to the muscles, which leads to more O2 to the muscles, which will decrease that venous output in the AVO2 equation. And then for mitochondrial activation, it's with exercise, you need more ATP, so mitochondria need to make more, and that's going to increase the O2 demand.
So with the AVO2 difference, exercise just a little bit more added on to that. The amount of O2 extracted is going to increase at the muscles. That's going to cause a shift in your oxygen saturation curve, and it's going to cause an oxygen cascade. Hemoconcentration is also going to increase your blood pressure, sweating, metabolic buildup. This is going to allow your fluid to leave your blood. There's going to be less space between your red blood cells because of the amount of fluid that's leaving. And this also is going to happen when it's in the capillaries. And you're also going to have a pretty constant O2 transport capacity. So how ABO2 is measured. So specifically in the blood, it's just the difference that's calculated directly by obtaining the difference between the concentration of oxygen in the arterial blood, which is going to be supplying your tissues, and the venous blood, which is going to be draining out of the tissue. So that difference of blood that's going to the tissues versus leaving the tissues. And this can also be found in your textbook.
So for ABO2, it involves the oxygen cascade, which essentially is just the flow of oxygen from air intake when you breathe it in all the way down to mitochondria and how much is lost over time through the steps. Moves from higher levels of pressure oxygen to lower, and low solubility of oxygen is what necessitates short diffusion distances, which means that we have more dense capillaries for the oxygen to go through. Exercise causes an increase in oxygen during cascade and leads to an increase in VO2 difference. This is like all shown by the hemoglobin dissociation curve. As you can see, essentially it's the binding of one carbon CO molecule to hemoglobin increases the affinity of the other binding spot to oxygen. And that prevents unloading, and that is usually when it's on a left shift. The Bohr effect, the decrease in pH or increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is what leads to a rightward shift. Rightward shift increases O2 extraction and therefore increases your VO2 max. You can see all the factors that tend to a left shift or right shift on the graph. There's either a change in temperature, an increase in pH, decrease in oxygen pressure, and for a right shift, which is what causes there to be more unloading and increases the amount of oxygen that actually reaches down your mitochondria, is an increase in all those factors or a decrease in pH. That's it.
And what questions do we have to discuss? So to summarize those things that increase ABO2 difference from rest of X. So more blood capillaries, flash phase dilation, at the right shift, and increased mitochondrial activity. Did you say the hemo concentration? What did that one too? Right? Yeah. Okay. And then that.
Yeah, and then just the amount of extracting.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so there's four reasons. Great, good job. All right, so again, just my shorthand notes, like we just summarized right there, those four reasons. And they had a lot of other great information too. Those four reasons, so more blood in the capillaries, caused by the things that cause vasodilation, right, that are all related to that. That rightward shift caused by three things as well: temperature, CO2, and hydrogen. Okay, mitochondrial activity, and you guys explained very nicely the O2 cascade. That's really what this is all about, right? Where if we decrease the amount of oxygen inside of our cells, then we create a greater diffusion gradient for oxygen. So we're going to pull more out of the blood. So right, if there's a bigger step between the blood and the cells, as far as partial pressure of oxygen goes, then more oxygen is going to move, right? So we pull more off the blood. We end up with less in the blood when it gets to the venous side, right? So that's all because of mitochondrial activity, right? If we're using up oxygen in the mitochondria, then that means we get less there. So then we get less in the step next to that, which was myoglobin, right? And then we're going to end up with less in the step next to that, which was just the cellular intracellular space, less in the step next to that, which was the interstitial space, right? So if that partial pressure of oxygen drops in the interstitial space, then we're gonna have a greater drop from blood to interstitial space, so more oxygen comes off the hemoglobin, right? So that's a big part of it. Yeah, and then the hemo concentration level we talked about before. If we squeeze plasma volume out, we're gonna at any given time period, we're gonna have more red blood cells in capillaries than we would have if we had more water between them, right? So that just means we're gonna extract more oxygen from them because we have red blood cells spending more time in the place where we can extract oxygen, which is capillaries, right? So yeah, so those four reasons. I know sometimes those can feel a little bit abstract. Any questions on what those four mean or how to think about those four? All right, yeah, so here's what I want to do next. So we can actually put these things together. We started out with calculating cardiac output at rest and at max of this fictional cross-country skier. And we said that his cardiac output would be 36 liters per minute, okay? And then by using the AVO2 difference from this slide back here, we can see something like a 15 ml of 15 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of blood as the AVO2 difference. And so then we can, this Fick equation thing, we can actually use it to calculate VO2, right? Because that's really what it is. It's VO2 equals cardiac output times AVO2 difference, right? So we can do that. So what you need to do though is you need to get these in the same units first, right? You can't multiply liters per minute times mils of O2 per 100 mils of blood. So we've got to you got to do some conversions there. But why don't you work with your teams for a second, see how well, and see what you guys can come up with. And then you're going to find what this person's VO2 max is by actually putting the Fick equation to use. Okay, so go ahead, take a couple minutes, see if you can do that, and then we'll continue on. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So I just need to hold on to it. Better finding but the more that there's just right, the more yeah. See that one slide? I think it's 15 milliliters of mercury per 100 milliliters of water.
I'm getting to know I started Oh, so
Question. Kinds of the other side of the equation. Think about this way, like, so like a typical VO2 max for an elite athlete might be somewhere between 5 and 7 liters per minute. So that should be
Yeah.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay. So there's a couple different like orders of ways to do this, right? But the idea would be to get the cardiac output into mils per minute first. All right, so that's what I did here. 36,000 mils per minute of blood, times that by the 15 mils of oxygen per 100 mils there. So then we just need to get rid of this 100 mils. All right, so if we're dividing by 100 mils, we'll multiply by 100 mils, we end up eventually with something like 54,000 liters per minute, I think, right? And then you have to convert that. Yeah, so you can end up with somewhere around 5.4 liters per minute for the VO2 max. If this person, to put this back in terms that we looked at before for VO2 max, if this person was about 75 kilograms, which would be maybe a weight for an elite cross-country skier, that's around 72 ml per kg. So just kind of wanted to prove you that this equation isn't just a conceptual thing, and we can actually use it to calculate VO2. Yeah. So yeah, and you wouldn't have to do a calculation like this specifically on the test. Yeah, I definitely want you to know how to calculate cardiac output, stroke volume, ejection fraction, those things, but not this one. So, questions on any of that? So yeah, so that's about a typical VO2 max somewhere, like I said, 5 or 6 liters per minute would be a very high VO2 max for an elite athlete. Did any of you watch any of the cross-country skiing in the past couple weeks of the Olympics? Yeah. Yeah, it's always weird for us to see, like when I show that slide with the highest VO2 max values ever recorded, the majority of them are cross-country skiers, right? But then you see what they do and you watch it in the Olympics and it's just insane. Right? I mean, and then the ones that like they're skiing for a couple hours and have to stop and shoot a gun, right? You see that one, like have to shoot it and they're like dead on these little targets. So yeah, they're incredible endurance athletes, no question. I was at a conference once where they were talking about comparing humans to racehorses and looking at VO2 max and racehorses. And actually passed around like a racehorse's heart. And it was like a racehorse that had died, and then they kind of like did some kind of treatment to the heart, so it'd be like hard, but it was literally like this big, like the heart was. And the VO2 max of a racehorse in liters per minute is typically somewhere around like 40 to 50 liters per minute, whereas ours is like 5. You know, a really high one would be around 5. But then the cardiac output in those horses is somewhere around 180 liters to 200 liters per minute. Whereas ours is like 30 if we're really fit, right? So it's just incredible animals. But that's partially why they can actually run themselves to death in those races because their cardiac output is just so incredibly high that it literally will burst their pulmonary capillaries. Their heart is so powerful that it can burst their lungs pretty much. And they don't usually think it was never showed on TV, but that does happen sometimes in those races where the horses are just like blood is just like spilling out of their mouths and they're coughing up blood. And there is, you know, some death that occurs in those horses because of that, because they're pushing themselves so hard and their hearts have just became so powerful that it just burst their lungs pretty much. So yeah, kind of sad situation, but incredible athletes for sure. Okay. On that note, but the last team can come on up and take us through this one here.
Okay. Ours is ventilatory threshold. So we can't talk about the causes of ventilatory threshold without addressing the lactate threshold. So lactate threshold occurs because of a sudden increase of lactate in the blood. Which you can see like on this graph over here. So it has the ventilation and then the lactic acid in your body, and then those two dots occur right around the same point. So lactate production exceeds clearance, and that's when you see that dramatic increase. The lactate threshold predicts endurance performance in a homogeneous sample, and it also gives us a good idea of what a sustainable VO2 max would be, like what percentage someone can pace at. And then the ventilatory threshold, what causes this is when ventilation increases faster than one's VO2. And this occurs when lactate begins to accumulate in the blood. So those two kind of go
So the ventilatory threshold is the intensity at which ventilation begins to rise in excess of VO2. VE is the volume of gas expired in liters per minute. VO2 is the volume of oxygen consumed, and VCO2 is the volume of carbon dioxide produced. The ventilatory threshold is the point just before VE and VO2 and threshold output can crack to rise about a similar rise in VE divided by VCO2. So in summary, this is more conceptually easier to view at rest, begin at rest, and then the threshold one is when breathing begins to increase, lactate begins to accumulate in the blood. So Nathan was talking about earlier. VCO2, that's when we're out of breath, high intensity exercising. Lactate has quickly accumulated in the blood, and the person needs to breathe heavily. And the final state is VO2 max, which we talked about in lab as well, and conclude due to exhaustion.
Okay, so for the lactate system or lactate, you have the glycolytic system, which produces pyruvate, and it can then go into the anaerobic cycle, which is it gets converted into lactic acid, or goes to a PEP cycle, which requires oxygen. And so exercise creates a deficit O2 and increased demand for ATP. And so to meet that demand, more pyruvate is converted to lactic acid, which then associates in the muscle fiber and increases the concentration of protons, which decreases pH. And so in order for your body to come and make it back to normal, like normal values, it uses the bicarbonate buffering system. So as you can see here, as the proton levels increase, then that leads to more CO2 on the other side being produced. And so since CO2 is like the main driving force of ventilation, as lactic acid builds up, your body converts it, the proton into CO2, which then stimulates the chemoreceptors and therefore increases ventilation.
And then a few factors that that drive the include muscles, so diaphragm and constant muscles and abdominal muscles, air resistance, compliance of the lungs, surface tension of the lungs. And then during exercise, ventilation increases due to increased inspiratory center stimulation. And this is caused by central command and neural feedback and muscle activity. And then alone, exercise intensities, increased ventilation is accomplished by increases in tidal volume.
Okay, great. Any questions for this guy? Okay, very good. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Yeah, they did an excellent job explaining all of that. I'm not really adding anything, but I'm just gonna reiterate what they said. This part up here about the definition of lactate threshold, that's an important one. It's when lactate production exceeds our ability to clear lactate. Okay, and that kind of assumes that in this period of time. So this is like a VO2 max test, right? So it's on the intensity is getting harder. We see oxygen consumption going up each step of the way. All right, we have no change in blood lactate. Okay, but that doesn't mean we're not using more of the glycolytic system each step of the way. right? Because we have the ability to deal with that lactate, so it never shows up in the blood, right? And that's the whole idea of that production exceeding clearance, is that, yeah, going from point number 1 on the yellow line there, which is 1.0, to point number 2 to the, like maybe the 4th point, which is an oxygen consumption of 2.0, we definitely are using the glycolytic system more at the 2nd point, right? It's not that we're not using it at all, we're using it more, but we're able to, all the lactate that's made, we're able to deal with it so it never shows up in the blood, right? So that's the clearance part. Right? So we're able to clear it, even though we're producing more, but then something happens around here, or we're producing so much now that it starts showing up in the blood because it's beyond our capacity to totally deal with it, so it never shows up, right? So that's the key part about lactate. And then you guys said it very nicely, lactate threshold is a good predictor of endurance performance in a homogeneous sample, meaning that people that all have a similar VO2 max, right? So people that are all kind of on a similar scale as far as endurance, or as far as like the cross-country team or something like that. Lactate threshold is going to tell us more about who's faster than VO2 max would, but then this part over here, VO2 max would be a better predictor of somebody's endurance performance if we just looked at a big range of people, which might be everybody on this campus, right? From very low VO2 maxes to very high VO2 maxes. That one's going to be better for that, okay? And you guys said all of that. This is a super key point here, right? CO2 is the main driver of ventilation in our bodies, even though other things also drive ventilation as well, like Braden was saying. Our muscles, our proprioceptors, our muscle spindles, our Golgi tendon organs, that's all related to breathing somehow, but lots of other things. But CO2 is going to be the primary driver. Hydrogen is related to this because, as Emmeline just described, hydrogen will eventually cause the formation of CO2, right? But the one key point I want to make with ventilation is different than lactate, right? It's actually going up the whole time. It's not like a flat thing and then it shoots up. It's going up the whole time. So anytime ventilation goes up, it has to be because there was more CO2 in the blood, right? Because if CO2 is our main driver of breathing, then that must mean that there's more CO2 in the blood, right? So, but if our lactate isn't getting into the blood yet during that first period, what's our source of the extra CO2 that's driving our ventilation up in that first period of increase? Right? This means from here to here, this means more CO2 is in the blood, and that's causing us to breathe more. Where'd that CO2 come from? Where does CO2 come from in the body? Our cells, yeah. Yeah, it's a byproduct of our oxidative system, right? Yeah, so it just means that we're using our oxidative system more, right? Going from here to here, we have to do more oxidative metabolism because we need more ATP to exercise at a faster speed or a greater intensity, right? So we, a lot of times when we think about this ventilation thing, we're just thinking about the CO2 from buffering, but we have lots of CO2 being produced just by the oxidative system too, right? So we're getting more CO2 each step of the way, more oxidative system, more oxidative system, more oxidative system. And then all of a sudden it's not on this linear path anymore. All of a sudden it gets steeper. So what that means is there's an extra source of CO2 that starts accumulating right there, right? And that's directly linked to the lactate one, right? Because now this is what takes us to the buffering part, right? Because we're even going from before the threshold to after the threshold, we're still using the oxidative system more too, right? Because it's a higher intensity. So we get more CO2 from that, but then we add on the additional CO2 that came from the buffering system too, right? So we got our H plus HCO3 negative, turns into carbonic acid, and then eventually turns into CO2 and water. All right, so this is our source of the extra CO2, is that buffering, but we're still adding more CO2 to our system because of the oxidative system too, right? So it's both now. So it's with that extra CO2, it makes that relationship steeper, right? It increases the slope of that line. It doesn't mean all of a sudden we switch to glycolytic metabolism. That's not true. We've been using glycolytic metabolism the whole time. Now we're just using a little bit more of it, right? And so, yeah, that kind of gets at that. Okay. Does that make sense? Questions on that one? Definitely another tricky one conceptually. All right, so there's really just kind of one more set of things to talk about here, and these ones weren't assigned to anybody. So what I want you guys to talk about in your teams for a minute here is these last 4 slides, which are kind of all based around the same idea, which is one of my favorite things in physiology, is that if we just kind of understand one thing, then we can apply that to a bunch of things in the body, and it just makes sense. We don't have to necessarily memorize it, right? It's like it already makes sense, right? And that this is one of those examples here. Okay, so when we have increased levels of CO2, increased levels of hydrogen, increased temperature, or decrease in oxygen, that has some effects on number one, our ventilation, right? Also affects our artery size. That also affects our oxygen loading and unloading. I want you guys to talk about where do those 3 things come from, okay? And so all of these things have something to do with pushing us to a higher VO2 and a higher exercise capacity, but they're also all related to fatigue too, right? In a way. Okay, so that's kind of what I want you to kind of walk through those slides a little bit. Deal with these ones first, at least. What do these things here do to ventilation, to artery size, oxygen loading and unloading, and talk about where they come from, and then we can kind of wrap up from there. Okay, spend a few minutes talking about that, and we'll come back to it.
Yeah, they're all like there. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, okay.
This is, there's a question related to this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we know for a fact each one's no, but I think artery size allows you more. Hey, I know.
I know. Word it down. Lactate.
Are they purposefully like this?
All right, guys, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay. I wanted to hear, I was listening. That was good. Yeah. Yeah, so for some reason, this one always scares people. I'll just tell you, there is a question that is related to this on the exam, and it's always like, no one chooses it compared to the other one. I was talking with them. I think some people get scared of that word, or they just don't know what that word is, metabolites. It's really just like kind of byproducts of metabolism, right? Things that we see when we do a lot of metabolism. Right? And so, yeah, so if we see an increase in CO2, an increase in hydrogen, an increase in temperature, what does that do to our ventilation? Increases it, okay, we breathe harder, okay, for sure. What does that do to our artery size? Which means all cause dilation. Okay, and that's kind of talking about local vasodilation, like where we're sensing those things, where we're sensing CO2, where we're sensing temperature. Not like full body vasodilation, that would be good for exercise, but right where we move the blood, right? And then oxygen loaded, unloaded, which way would those things shift the curve? Yeah, that kinds of way to shift. Okay, and then that increases unloading. Okay, so, yeah, and then let's just talk about where they come from, right? So start with CO2. We just went over this one, but where's the primary source of CO2? Byproduct of the what? The oxidative, that's perfect, yeah. Oxidative system. Okay, and then that other source of it that we talked about, that Emma explained to us nicely. What is it? They lactate in the whole buffering system, right? So yeah, so the whole bicarbonate, CO3 negative, bicarbonate buffer, right? That leads to some CO2. Okay, the hydrogen, where's that come from? Yeah, some from there. Most of that probably doesn't really leak out of our cells into the blood. But this would be lactate, right? The primarily lactate. That's really how we drive our pH down during exercise, is lactate. And then temperature. How do we increase why do we increase our temperature when we're exercising? Say it again. Release heat, okay. And this is related to that question you guys are working on in the lab, right? We're only maybe about 20% efficient, right? When it comes to when we break down energy in our body, only about 20% of that goes to doing something, right? The rest of it is just lost energy, right? So that's what the heat is lost energy. Same reason a car engine heats up, right? It's just the inefficiency of dealing with energy, right? If we lose something, we can't harness all of it, right? So it's just heat loss with ATP breakdown. Okay, so these are all things that happen when we exercise, right? When we increase our metabolism. All these things happen when we do that. And this is where it's kind of cool because these things all are kind of providing positive feedback in the early stages, right? They're allowing us to exercise more, right? We need more blood. We need to open up our blood vessels to send more blood to our exercising muscles. We need to do that right where it's shifted the curve so we can drop off our oxygen. We definitely need to breathe more, right? So we can do all that. So all those things are pushing us towards being able to exercise at a greater intensity, right? So these are kind of positive. This is all like positive feedback in the beginning, right? It's pushing us in the right direction so we can do more. Okay. But then we talked about how those hydrogen ions and temperature and CO2, those things are all related to us stopping too, right? When we reach a certain point, the body says, all right, that's actually too much. That's not positive feedback anymore. Now it's negative feedback. Those hydrogen ions hurt, right? Temperature makes it so you're super inefficient. You can't really do as much, right? You start feeling bad. Your brain is probably sensing those things and then not sending as much motor output anymore, right? So it's kind of this really cool system, right? All the things that come out of the systems we have to make energy, which is metabolism, right? All those things push us further, but then all those same things, once we get to a certain threshold, they also stop us. It really makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that's where it kind of switches to negative feedback at some point. And that's maybe what we can change a little bit, right? Well, we can change how much of those metabolites we produce, right? And how well we deal with them. We can also change psychologically, maybe like how much we can take, right? There is something to do with that when it comes to central fatigue. We can deal with more pain. We can deal with the brain might get a little more used to higher levels of CO2 or lower pH. And it lets you push yourself a little bit further, right, than it used to. So there are sort of training type things that happen in there for sure. But yeah. Questions on that? All right. Hey guys, have a great weekend. See you on Monday. Got that quiz and the concept map. So the concept map doesn't actually have to be turned in until the end of the day on Monday. So, but quiz will be when you start class. So, well, I'll see you then.